The chamber lights hung heavy, throwing sharp angles across polished wood and tired faces. Senators shuffled papers, aides leaned in with whispers, and the air carried that brittle tension that only comes when politics transforms into theater. In that silence, Rand Paul leaned forward, his voice slicing through like a blade. With a smirk curling at the edge of his lips, he mocked Jasmine Crockett's education. Not a critique of policy, not an argument of law. A sneer aimed at her very foundation, her right to even be there. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The cameras caught every flicker of expression, every raised brow. Across the room, there was a low rustle, a muffled gasp, a shift of disbelief, as if the walls themselves were offended by the arrogance on display. They were meant for the audience watching at home, a performance designed to belittle, to cast doubt, to reduce her identity to a punchline. And yet, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She did not recoil or rush to defend herself. Instead, she sat, with a stillness that demanded attention, her eyes fixed, her expression calm, her silence louder than his insult. That silence carried weight. It was the kind of silence that made viewers lean closer to their screens, waiting, wondering what was about to follow. Paul leaned back, satisfied, convinced he had delivered a decisive blow. But Crockett's measured composure told another story. This was not the face of defeat. This was the calm before the storm. Because while Rand Paul played for applause in the moment, Jasmine Crockett was holding on to something more powerful than a witty retort or a raised voice. She carried with her the kind of evidence that doesn't just answer an insult, it rewrites the script entirely. The room didn't know it yet, but the balance of this clash was already shifting. Arrogance had just stepped into a trap it couldn't see, and dignity was waiting patiently to spring it. What no one expected was the recording. Jasmine Crockett had been holding on to a recording that would flip the entire narrative upside. Down. Education in America has always been more than a credential. It is a battleground, a symbol of legitimacy, and for many, the ticket into rooms where power is negotiated. When Rand Paul mocked Jasmine Crockett's education, he wasn't simply questioning her resume. He was attempting to strip away her authority, to reduce her presence in that chamber to something unearned, something lesser. In a country where credentials often become the shorthand for credibility, his jab carried venom far beyond the surface. But here's the truth. This wasn't just about one senator sneering at one congresswoman. It was about a much older playbook, one that has been used time and again to keep women, people of color and working-class voices from being taken seriously. When Paul made his dig, he was tapping into a vein of American history that has dismissed brilliance when it came in a package that defied the old order. Consider the layers of his insult. At its core was gender, the centuries-long assumption that women in power must somehow prove themselves twice over, that their achievements are suspect, that their confidence is arrogance, while a man's is strength. Laid over, that was race, the ugly undertone that a black woman standing firm in a room of mostly white men somehow doesn't belong, that her authority must be questioned, her qualifications undermined, and stitched through it all was class. The insinuation that, unless you come from the right pedigree, with the right names on your degree, you're playing out of your league. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a performance, sharpened by generations of bias. The cameras caught his grin, his condescension, the way he expected laughter to ripple around him. That moment wasn't just about diminishing Jasmine Crockett. It was about reinforcing a hierarchy, about reminding everyone watching on the Senate floor in the news cycle. At home, who was supposed to have the last word, but what Paul underestimated was how familiar those words sounded to Jasmine Crockett. She had heard them before. In classrooms, where professors questioned her sharpness, courtrooms, where her advocacy was measured against stereotypes, in the quiet spaces of politics where whispers doubted her staying power. The difference was, Crockett had turned that rhythm into resilience. This time, she wasn't going to let it slide. By holding her silence in that chamber, she wasn't conceding. She was building. Poise is a weapon, and Jasmine Crockett wielded it with precision. While Paul thought he was writing the headline, Crockett was setting the stage for a reversal no one saw coming. She didn't need to raise her voice in the moment because she had something stronger, proof. And not just any proof. recording. The weight of that reality lingered in her calm. Every second she sat still was a second that the balance of power shifted. Every moment Paul basked in his insult was a moment closer to his undoing. Because in American politics, the real drama isn't always in the insult delivered. It's in the reckoning that comes after. Crockett knew exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just her reputation. It was the message sent to every young black girl watching. Every woman dismissed in a meeting, every voter tired of watching arrogance crush dignity. Paul had played his hand with arrogance. Crockett was about to answer with truth, and when she did, it wouldn't just silence him. It would expose the machinery of mockery itself. Rand Paul has long cultivated an image that straddles libertarian idealism and contrarian swagger. To his base, he is the iconoclast who refuses to bow to political norms. But to those who have crossed him in Senate hearings, his reputation is defined by something far less noble, a streak of arrogance that thrives on belittlement. Watch the tapes of his exchanges and a pattern emerges. The smirk before a jab. The exaggerated lean in his chair, as though the room itself were his living room and the rest of the Senate his audience. The clipped laughter that punctuates his dismissals, not with humor, but with disdain. Again, Paul has used his platform not to build bridges of understanding, but to elevate himself by tearing others down. One of his most infamous habits is his treatment of witnesses during hearings. Whether it's public health experts, political adversaries, or even his own colleagues, Paul leans into mockery as his weapon of choice. Take his sparring matches with Dr. Anthony Fauci. Moments when the nation looked for clarity, Paul offered condescension. He wasn't simply debating policy. Journalists covering him often describe his tone as professorial but cutting, a mixture of smug certainty and a refusal to grant legitimacy to anyone who challenges him. His posture in hearings says it all. Arms crossed, chin lifted. The body language of someone who views disagreement as inferiority. This is the man who mocked. Jasmine Crockett. A man who has made a career out of mistaking arrogance for authority, but the dismissive, condescending kind that leaves others visibly grinding their teeth in frustration. What makes his behavior sting even deeper is the historical echo. In a chamber where women, and especially women of color, remain underrepresented. Paul's brand of arrogance reinforces centuries-old power dynamics. To laugh at Crockett's education was not just a personal insult. It was a signal, a reminder, of who is presumed to hold legitimacy in the American hierarchy of power. But arrogance carries a cost. Because in every performance, Paul leaves fingerprints of condescension that his opponents can trace. He has built a public persona on the idea that he cannot be touched, that his mockery is unassailable. Yet history is littered with figures who flew too close to their own hubris. Every sneer, every dismissive laugh, behind closed doors whispers circulate that Paul often plays to the cameras more than to the issues, that he relishes the spectacle of one-upmanship more than the grind of governance. He thrives in the theater of belittlement. The Senate has long been his stage, but the problem with always seeking the stage is that eventually the curtain falls. And when it does, the performance is judged not by the swagger, but by the substance. In mocking Jasmine Crockett, Paul believed he was adding another chapter to his repertoire of dismissals, another soundbite where his laughter drowned out opposition. What he didn't know was that Crockett had been listening, watching, waiting. She understood his type, the man who mistakes interruption for intelligence, who hides insecurity behind smirks, who underestimates those he deems beneath him. And she had something he wasn't prepared for: patience. The poise to let him write his own undoing, because every villain, whether in politics or in legend, writes the script of their own downfall. They build their arrogance so high, so unshakable, that they cannot imagine being toppled. But the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. And Rand Paul, in that chamber with those cameras rolling, just handed Jasmine Crockett the perfect setup. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the grandeur of marble halls or the spotlight of televised hearings. It begins in the quiet hours of persistence. In neighborhoods where opportunity was never handed out freely, and in classrooms where she fought for every inch of recognition. Her education was not a birthright polished by privilege. It was a battlefield she crossed with grit, sacrifice, faith. Long before Rand Paul mocked her credentials, Crockett knew what it was like to be underestimated. She had walked into lecture halls where whispers followed her, whispers questioning whether someone like her belonged. She had felt the weight of expectations pressing down, not from encouragement, but from doubt. And yet she stayed. She studied late into the night, textbooks worn at the edges, notes scribbled with a determination that came not from ambition alone, but from necessity. For Crockett, education was not simply about collecting degrees. It was survival. It was a shield against a world eager to box her in, eager to dismiss her. Every paper she turned in, every exam she aced, every legal principle she mastered was more than academic achievement. It was a statement that she refused to be silenced, refused to be erased. Her path into the courtroom carried that same fire. As a young lawyer, she did not seek cases that were comfortable or easy. She sought the ones that mattered, the ones where people without a voice, families struggling under unfair laws, neighbors facing systemic injustice, needed someone who would stand. Even when the odds looked impossible, imagine her in those early days, nights spent preparing, briefs until exhaustion blurred the words on the page. Mornings walking into courtrooms where opposing counsel towered with resources, prestige, and smug certainty. Yet Crockett never wavered. She carried herself with dignity, fought with precision, and understood that every victory, no matter how small, was a step toward rewriting a system that had long ignored people who looked like her. Her resilience was not abstract. It was born of lived struggle, bills that had to be paid, doors that had to be forced open, ceilings that had to be cracked. Crockett's discipline was forged in real life, not in theory. And that discipline carried her into public service, where she became not just a representative of a district, but a voice for every woman and man who had ever been told. They did not belong in the rooms where decisions were made. To understand her is to understand that her education was never a credential to boast of. It was armor, a form of protection against a world eager to strip dignity from those without inherited power. And like armor, it bore scratches and dents from the battles she fought. But it also gleamed with a resilience that arrogance could. Never tarnished when Rand Paul mocked her education, revealed how little he understood about what it takes to rise from where she came. To him, a degree might be a line on a resume, a stepping stone easily achieved. To Crockett, it was the difference between silence and a platform, between invisibility and influence. Her education was not ornamental. It was earned through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. And here was the twist Paul never saw coming. What he mocked, she had already weaponized, because Crockett knew men like him. She had debated them in classrooms, argued against them in courtrooms, and faced them in politics. She knew their rhythms, their reliance on arrogance, their blind spots when it came to underestimating women like her. You didn't need to shout him down to win. You only needed to let him underestimate her and then strike at the right moment. Strike would come in the form of a secret she had carried, waiting for the moment when arrogance opened the door, recording precise, undeniable, and devastating. While Paul laughed, while he leaned back in his chair, dripping with condescension, Crockett's patience was already positioning her next move. Her entire journey had prepared her for this. The studying in silence, the courtrooms filled with doubt, community battles where every word mattered. Each step taught her the value of timing, the importance of restraint, and the power of revealing truth when it mattered most. So when Paul tried to turn her education into a punchline, he was not mocking a piece of paper. He was mocking her survival. He was mocking the shield she had carried through every fight. And in doing so, he gave her the chance to transform that shield into a sword. Her education was not just a degree. It was survival. It was armor. And now, in front of the nation, it was about to become her weapon, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just prepared to defend herself against arrogance. She was prepared to expose it, and the recording she held was the blade sharpened by every battle she had ever fought. And as the tension in that chamber mounted, one truth became undeniable. Paul thought he was mocking her, but in reality, He had just handed her the moment she was born to seize, the silence after. Rand Paul's jab seemed to stretch across the chamber like a taut wire ready to snap. He leaned back in his chair, smirking, his fingers drumming lazily against the desk, as though he had already claimed victory. The arrogance in his posture was unmistakable, man convinced he had reduced his opponent to silence. But Jasmine Crockett was not silent. She was calculating. She adjusted the microphone in front of her, took a breath that was steady, unhurried, and then lifted her gaze directly toward Paul. The composure in her eyes was striking, not defensive, not wounded, but clear and resolute. When she spoke, her words carried the kind of clarity that cuts through arrogance without ever raising the volume. Senator, my education is not a punchline. It is the very reason I sit here today, to hold power accountable, even when that power seeks to belittle instead of debate. The room stirred. A few heads tilted in quiet recognition of the line's weight. Cameras zoomed closer, eager to capture her unflinching expression. Paul gave a short, mocking laugh, tilting his head as if to dismiss her entirely. "Oh, come on," he scoffed, waving his hand. "We're not here to glorify resumes. Some of us actually got here by doing the work." There it was again, the smirk, the condescension. He leaned forward now, eyes narrowing, trying to rattle her with tone alone. His voice carried that mixture of disdain and performative charm. Crafted for sound bites, meant to humiliate rather than engage. But Crockett didn't blink. She leaned in slightly, her voice calm, each syllable deliberate. "And some of us, Senator, got here by doing the work in communities you've never set foot in, fighting battles you've never had to fight." A ripple passed through the audience, an audible murmur, a sharp intake of breath. Staffers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension was no longer a silent undercurrent. It was visible, alive, humming between every corner of the room. Paul chuckled again, but this time the laughter felt thinner, forced. His shoulders tightened, his smirk flickered into something almost defensive. He tried to double down, raising his voice just slightly, the way a man does when he feels control slipping through his fingers. "Look, nobody's questioning your background," he said, drawing out the last word with deliberate weight. "But let's not pretend a degree automatically makes you qualified to lecture the Senate." There was the condescension, sharp, unmistakable. Crockett simply sat straighter, allowing his words to land without a flinch. The more he postured, the calmer she became. She folded her hands lightly on the desk, her composure almost luminous against his visible irritation. The contrast was stark. On one side, arrogance twisting into defensiveness. On the other, dignity sharpening into authority. The audience could feel it. The whispers grew louder. Journalists' pens scratched furiously across notepads, and even fellow senators shifted, recognizing that something significant was unfolding. Crockett let the silence hang for a moment after his last remark, her calm presence magnifying the tension. Then she spoke again, softer this time, but with a gravity that made every ear in the chamber lean closer. "Senator Paul, I've heard these kinds of words before. Words meant to diminish, meant to distract. But I came here prepared. Prepared. Not just with my story, but with the truth." She paused, her eyes steady, her voice unwavering. The room was locked in anticipation. Every camera was trained on her, every hand stilled over notes. Every breath seemed to hitch in collective suspense. Then, with the chamber hanging on her next move, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. Her voice clear as glass, and said 6 words that made everyone lean forward in disbelief. "Let's play something for the record." The chamber grew still, as if the very air was holding its breath. Crockett's words, "Let's play something for the record," hung heavy in the silence, sparking whispers that darted across the room like sparks from a fire. Paul's smirk faltered just slightly, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Had walked into this exchange certain of his dominance, convinced his barbs would go unanswered. What he hadn't realized was that Crockett had been holding a weapon far more devastating than a clever retort. Staffer brought over a small device. Crockett gave a nod, her hands calm, her face composed. Then, with the push of a button, Paul's own voice filled the chamber. The recording crackled at first, then came through with chilling clarity. We should never belittle someone's education. That's the foundation of service, the root of opportunity. If we dismiss education, we dismiss the very system that brought us here. It was unmistakable. Ran Paul's voice, clear as day. A statement he had made in a prior interview, broadcasted and recorded, now resurrected in front of the entire chamber. His own words standing in direct contradiction to the insult he had just hurled at Crockett. The room reacted instantly. Gasps rippled like a wave. Some senators exchanged startled glances. Aides froze mid-motion. Journalists bent forward so far, their pens nearly fell from their hands. The camera zoomed in on Paul's face, catching the instant his expression cracked. The smirk dissolved. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted, as if searching for an escape. But Crockett wasn't finished. She pressed play again. Alita's job isn't to mock or tear down. It's to uplift, to debate on substance, not to dismiss based on background. Another line, another dagger. Each sentence, a reminder of Paul's hypocrisy. Each phrase, a mirror held up to his arrogance. The arrogance of mocking someone else's education, and he himself had once admitted the sacred value of respecting it. By now, the room was electrified. The silence between each line was louder than any shout could have been. You could almost hear the pounding of hearts, the collective awareness that a shift had occurred. Arrogance had been undone by its own hand. When the recording stopped, the chamber remained frozen for a beat. Paul sat stiffly, his face tight. With the flush of exposure, Crockett leaned forward, her voice calm, almost gentle. It sharpened with the precision of truth. Senator Paul, those are your words, not mine. Your words spoken with conviction about the importance of education, about the dignity it represents, about the hypocrisy of mocking what you once praised. Her tone wasn't loud. She didn't need to raise her voice. Strength came from the contrast, his sneering arrogance against her unshakable clarity. You may try to dismiss me with a smirk, but your own words remind us all. Education is not a weakness. It is not a punchline. It is the foundation of service. You said so yourself. I will never apologize for standing on that foundation. The chamber erupted. Some applauded softly, others exchanged nods of approval. Even those who sat in silence could not disguise the recognition in their eyes. Crockett had not only defended herself, she had dismantled him with his own voice, turned his weapon back against him, and left him with nowhere to stand. Paul tried to interject, leaning forward with a strained smile. That was taken out. Of context, he began, his voice sharper now, tinged with desperation, but Crockett did not waver. She held up her hand, calm but commanding. Context? She said evenly. The context is clear. You understood once that education was vital. You said it yourself. And yet today you chose to weaponize it against me. That contradiction isn't mine to explain. It's yours. A hush fell again. Paul's mouth opened, then closed. The camera zoomed tighter, capturing the flicker of unease in his eyes. For a man so often smug and unshaken, the cracks were undeniable. And outside the chamber, the ripple effect began instantly. Clips of the exchange hit social media within minutes. Hashtags erupted across Twitter. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag education is power. Hashtag Paul exposed. TikTok filled with side-by-side edits of Paul's mocking smirk followed by the damning playback of his own words. Instagram Reels replayed the 6 words. Let's play something for the record, like a cinematic trailer. The world wasn't just watching. It was celebrating. Commentators called it one of the most devastating mic drop moments in modern Senate history. Celebrities reposted the clip with captions like, "This is how you handle arrogance." Teachers across the country shared it with their students as an anthem of resilience. Immigrant parents texted it to their children with pride, proof that dignity can triumph over dismissal. But for Crockett, it wasn't about going viral. It was about principle. She sat back in her chair, the calm returning to her face, and spoke once more. Her voice carrying the weight of generations who had been told they were not enough. My education is not something to mock. It represents every long night of study. When I could have given up, it represents my community who believed in me when others doubted. It represents every young person watching this who wonders if their hard work matters. It does. It always will. And no amount of mockery can take that away. Her words landed with finality. The chamber was quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing left to challenge. She had spoken not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been belittled for daring to rise above where they were told they belonged. Rand Paul sat in silence, his smirk gone, his posture deflated. He had played the part of the arrogant villain, certain of his power. But Crockett had rewritten the script, turning his arrogance into his undoing. And as the session moved forward, one truth was undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had not only survived his mockery, she had transformed it into a moment of empowerment. A beacon for everyone who had ever been dismissed. The hero had spoken. The villain had been exposed. And the nation had just witnessed a masterclass in turning insult into inspiration. But what would happen after the chamber? Adjourned when the clip escaped the walls of Washington and ignited a movement across the country, would be even more explosive. For a moment, the chamber remained suspended in silence. It wasn't the silence of indifference, but the kind that follows a lightning strike, charged, humming, undeniable. Every eye flicked between Crockett, seated with poise, and Paul, shrinking under the weight of his own words, played back like an indictment. Some of Crockett's colleagues shifted forward in their seats, their faces etched with restrained admiration. A few offered small nods, not overt applause, but signals of respect. Others, especially her allies, could not contain their smiles, quietly reveling in the precision with which she had dismantled arrogance. Across the aisle, Paul's supporters fidgeted, avoided eye contact, or muttered excuses under their breath. One aide scribbled something furiously on a notepad, as if trying to rewrite the scene in real time, but it was too late. The narrative had already escaped the room. Outside, in the digital arena, it was a wildfire. Within minutes of Crockett's calm, devastating counter, clips of the recording were everywhere. On Twitter, hashtag Crockett clapback shot into the trending list, quickly joined by hashtag Paul exposed and hashtag education is power. Short looping edits captured the exact moment Crockett leaned forward and said, "Let's play something for the record," followed by Paul's frozen reaction. TikTok stitched the scene with triumphant music, transforming her 6 words into a rallying cry. Instagram Reels layered captions like when receipts speak louder than arrogance over Paul's withering smirk. The memes were relentless. One showed Paul holding a microphone only to have it snatched away by Crockett pressing play. Another split-screened his mockery beside his own recorded words with the caption, "Narrator, he did, in fact, say that." Teachers, students, immigrants, and activists reshared the clips with messages of pride, gratitude, and validation. Commentators weighed in quickly. A well-known political analyst tweeted, "This wasn't just a clapback. This was a masterclass in dignity under fire." A civil rights leader posted, "Jasmine Crockett just showed America what happens when truth is armed with preparation." She didn't just defend herself. She defended every community told they don't belong. Celebrities chimed in too. An Oscar-winning actress reposted the clip with the caption, "Get you a leader who carries receipts." A best-selling author wrote, "Mockery falls flat when confronted with calm truth. Crockett's composure is what courage looks like." Meanwhile, Rand Paul's camp scrambled. Reporters surrounded him as he left the chamber. Microphones thrust toward his face. Questions shouted over one another. "Do you stand by your comments? Was that your voice on the recording? Do you regret mocking Representative?" Crockett's education. Paul's answers were evasive, clipped, and brittle. Context, he muttered repeatedly, a word that sounded weaker each time it left his lips. He avoided eye contact with cameras, his usual smirk nowhere to be seen. By the time he retreated behind closed doors, the narrative was already solidified. Arrogance met its match, and dignity had won. Crockett, on the other hand, didn't bask in the victory. When she stepped out, she carried the same calm composure. She had shown inside. Reporters swarmed her, and she paused just long enough to deliver a single, measured statement: "Education is not a punchline. It is the backbone of service, of opportunity, of our democracy. I will never apologize for mine, and I hope no young person watching ever feels they should." Then she moved on, leaving behind words that echoed far beyond the microphones. The contrast could not have been starker. Paul, shrinking, dodging, fumbling. Crockett, standing tall, measured, unwavering. The villain and the hero etched clearly in the public imagination. And the public didn't just watch, they participated. High school students posted about staying up late studying, inspired by Crockett's words. Immigrant families celebrated her as proof that hard work and resilience could triumph over mockery. College professors replayed the moment in lectures about rhetoric and power. The scene inside the chamber had become a national parable overnight. Paul versus Jasmine Crockett. It was about every time arrogance tried to diminish dignity, and every time dignity stood its ground. But Crockett knew something deeper. Viral moments fade. Hashtags trend today and vanish tomorrow. The true impact of what she had done wasn't in the applause or the memes. It was in the reminder to every person who had been dismissed for their background, their gender, their race, their education, that dignity is power. That truth, when wielded with patience, can shatter arrogance more completely than anger ever could. And yet, the most profound lesson wasn't in the chamber or on the timelines. It was in the moral clarity left behind. Clarity that asked the nation to look in the mirror and decide which side of the exchange they wanted to embody. Because beyond the viral moment, beyond the headlines and hashtags, one truth remained. The lesson ran deeper. One that would outlast any news cycle. What Jasmine Crockett did in that chamber was more than a sharp exchange, more than a viral clapback. It was a reframing of the entire battle. Paul wanted to reduce her education to a punchline, her background to a target, her dignity to something disposable. But Crockett turned the insult on its head. She made education the very source of her power, dignity, her most unshakable weapon. In truth, the shield that arrogance could not pierce in that moment. Education was no longer a credential listed. On paper, it was the living evidence of preparation, resilience, and perseverance. She reminded the country that to mock education is to mock the foundation of opportunity itself. Her message was unmistakable. The paths we carve through knowledge. Discipline and sacrifice cannot be diminished by sneers. They can only be strengthened by challenge and dignity. That word that often feels too fragile in politics came steel in Crockett's hands. She never raised her voice, never sank to insult, never let Paul drag her into his theater. Instead, she let truth speak for itself. In an age where outrage is currency, Crockett chose composure. And by doing so, she transformed what Paul meant. As humiliation into an undeniable victory, the lesson is universal. Every person who has ever been mocked for their accent, belittled for their school, dismissed for where they came from, they saw themselves in her. She taught us that mockery does not define worth. What defines us is how we answer it. And the answer that wins is not rage nor retreat, but dignity, truth, and courage. Think of it. Arrogance feeds on reaction. It thrives when we explode in anger, when we crumble under shame, when we let it dictate the terms of our self-worth. But Crockett's example shows another path. To stand firm, to let evidence speak, to walk through the storm without bending. This is how humiliation is transfigured into triumph. It is not just Crockett's story. It is America's story. Because our history is a tapestry of moments where dignity stood up against arrogance and truth outlasted mockery. From the classroom to the courtroom, from the picket line to the voting booth. Progress has always been written by those who refuse to be defined by insult. Crockett's stand is a reminder of what kind of nation we want to be. Do we want to reward derision, or do we want to honor discipline? Do we measure people by the sneers of the powerful, or by the integrity with which they answer? In that chamber, America glimpsed the choice and saw how one woman's courage could illuminate the higher road. There's a reason her moment resonated so widely online, far beyond the walls of Congress. It wasn't simply entertainment. It was recognition. Viewers saw not just a politician defending herself, but a parable about what resilience looks like in the face of arrogance. They saw the embodiment of a truth that transcends politics, that dignity is strength, not weakness. That truth is defense, not fragility. That courage is not loudness, but steadiness. So when Crockett looked Paul in the eye and pressed play, it was not just a clapback, it was a demonstration. A demonstration that America's values are not secured in sound bites, but in the way we carry ourselves when mocked, diminished, or underestimated. Her story is now larger than her. It is a story for every student buried in late-night textbooks, every worker overlooked for their accent, every immigrant told they don't belong. The lesson they can carry forward is this: you are not defined by mockery. How you answer it, and if you answer it with dignity, truth, and courage, you cannot be diminished. That is the legacy of this moment. Beyond the trending hashtags and the memes, it is a moral echo, a reminder that in a culture addicted to arrogance, the real revolution is dignity, and that every act of standing firm in the face of mockery, no matter how small, contributes to the larger fight for the values America claims to hold dear. Because this was never just Crockett versus Paul. This was dignity versus arrogance, truth versus insult, courage versus derision. And the lesson is clear when those battles come. We know which side history honors. Rand Paul thought his mockery would land his power. He thought belittling Jasmine Crockett's education would win him laughs, would chip away at her authority, would remind everyone in the room who held the upper hand. But arrogance is short-sighted. What he didn't count on was truth, and truth, once revealed, does not just answer arrogance, it destroys it. This moment wasn't simply about one exchange between two lawmakers. It was about something much larger. Whether we allow mockery to define our worth, or whether we rise with dignity to silence it. Crockett showed that when arrogance shouts, dignity doesn't need to raise its voice. When arrogance ridicules, truth speaks more powerfully. Arrogance tries to dismiss courage, answers in a way that cannot be ignored. The lesson is plain. But profound arrogance mocks, but it is always truth that triumphs. Crockett's recording wasn't just a counterattack. It was a living example of what happens when preparation meets disrespect, composure meets insult, when courage meets cruelty. She turned the weapon aimed at her into a mirror that revealed her opponent's weakness, and in doing so, she gave all of us a blueprint for responding to mockery in our own lives. So here is where we leave the story, but not the movement. If you believe dignity beats arrogance, share this moment. Let it travel farther than Paul's sneer ever could. If you believe truth must always triumph over dismissal, subscribe to stand with us. Together we can amplify voices that defend justice, truth, and equality. Because this isn't just about one clash in one chamber. It's about who we are and who we choose to be. And history will always remember the side of dignity.